Yo guys, it's your boy. Today we're talking about, you know, where these mountains once giant trees. There's an uncanny resemblance between mountains and giant tree stumps. And a lot of speculation said, but there were giant trees in antiquity, and these mountains are remnants, or just a stump of this giant tree. This rabbit hole is pretty wild if you think about it. So let's just investigate it and why they had to cut these giant trees down. What happened? What actually happened in antiquity?
Stump. Not a mountain, not a landscape, just a stump, flat surface, vertical sides, a base wider than its height, a form that looks abruptly cut rather than gradually formed. Now hold that image for a second, and then picture a mesa in Monument Valley, or one rising out of the Sahara, or any flat-topped formation you've ever seen from a distance, because once you place those two images side by side, something uncomfortable starts to happen. The
Yeah, it's an uncanny resemblance that cannot be denied whatsoever.
shapes are not just similar, they are structurally identical in a way that is difficult to ignore once you see it. And most people never notice it, not because it's hidden, but because it feels too familiar to question. We grow up seeing mountains as permanent, unquestionable features of the planet, something that exists outside of curiosity, something that doesn't require explanation beyond what we were taught once and then stopped thinking about. But the moment you isolate the shape itself, the conversation changes. Flat top, steep, almost vertical sides, a diameter that often exceeds the height. That is not a random form, that is a repeatable pattern, and it appears everywhere. You find it across the American Southwest, where entire landscapes are defined by these structures, rising abruptly from the desert floor. You find it in northern Africa, where isolated flat-topped formations stand surrounded by eroded terrain. You find variations of it on every continent, different climates, different rock types, same geometry. Now the official explanation is erosion. Resistant caprock sitting on top, softer material beneath, millions of years of wind and water, gradually removing everything around it until only the harder structure remains. And that explanation is not wrong.
Every one of these scientific, naturalistic explanations should never be taken for granted. You should question everything of what scientific explanation they actually give us.
It is well studied. It is supported by decades of geological research. But there is a detail inside that explanation that is rarely examined closely. Erosion explains how something is shaped. It does not explain what that shape originally was. It removes, it reveals, but it does not create the underlying form out of nothing. So the question becomes unavoidable once you slow down enough to ask it. What existed before erosion began? What kind of structure needs to be present in order for erosion to produce something this consistent, this vertical, this abruptly flat at the top? Because gradual processes usually produce gradual results, slopes, curves, irregular edges. But this shape is not gradual. It is abrupt. It looks interrupted. And that's where the discomfort begins. Because once you notice that interruption, you can't unsee it. Now here's where most explanations stop. They define the mechanism, they describe the process, and they move on. But if you stay with the question a little longer, something else starts to emerge. Because this isn't just one isolated example. This is a global pattern, and global patterns require consistent inputs. Not just consistent processes, but consistent starting forms. And that raises a second layer to the question. What kind of structure, repeated across different regions of the planet, could produce the same geometry after millions
The
of...
reason why human beings are conspiratorially minded, conspiratorially, I don't know if that's the right word, is because human beings are creatures of recognizing patterns. We can actually see recognize patterns itself, and we can actually question, this doesn't make sense. There's something consistent about these kinds of physical geological features.
years of erosion.
The naturalistic explanations doesn't make sense.
Because if the input is random, the output should vary. But here, the output repeats. And repetition is not something you ignore, it's something you investigate. Now I want to be careful here. I'm not dismissing the geological explanation. That would be the easiest mistake to make. Erosion is real. Caprock is real. Differential weathering is measurable and well understood. But there is a difference between explaining how something is reduced and explaining what existed before that reduction began. And that distinction matters more than it seems. Because once you separate those two things, mechanism and origin, the question opens up again. And this time, it opens in a direction most people never consider, because the shape we are looking at is not unique to geology. It exists somewhere else, in biology. Long before forests looked the way they do today, this planet supported organisms that don't fit cleanly into modern categories, structures that grew vertically, that maintained a wide base, that ended in a top surface that was relatively flat compared to their height. And those organisms are not theoretical, they are documented, which creates a very specific kind of tension, because now the same shape exists in two completely different contexts. One biological, one geological, and the connection between them is almost never explored directly. Not because it has been disproven, but because it hasn't been asked in a structured way. And that's where this starts to move beyond a simple observation. Because when a question exists between two fields that don't usually overlap, it doesn't get answered. It gets ignored, not intentionally, not through suppression, but because it doesn't belong cleanly to either side. And that's where some of the most interesting gaps appear, right at the boundary between what we already understand. Now I want you to hold one image in your mind, not a mountain, not a desert, but a single vertical structure rising out of a landscape that is otherwise low and flat, wide at the base, extending upward in a single column, ending in a surface that spreads out before stopping. Because that image existed on this planet long before anything we would call a tree. And in the next part, I'm going to show you exactly what that was, and why it makes this entire question harder to ignore than it should be. Once you move back far enough in time, the entire scale of life on land begins to shift in a way that does not match modern expectations. Because around 420 million years ago, during the late Silurian and early Devonian periods, the land surface was almost empty by today's standards, covered mostly in low vegetation with no trees, no forests, and nothing that resembled the ecosystems we are familiar with now. And yet rising above that landscape was something else entirely, an organism known as Prototaxites, which reached heights of up to 8 to 9 meters at a time, when most surrounding life barely reached knee height, meaning that the tallest living structure on land was already a vertical column dominating its environment long before trees ever appeared. What makes Prototaxites important is not just its height, but its structure. Because it did not grow with branches, it did not spread outward in complex forms. It rose upward as a single mass, wide at the base and extending vertically, and for over a century, scientists struggled to classify it, first identifying it as a type of tree, then as algae, and later as a fungus based on isotopic analysis, which means even at the scientific level, this organism does not fit cleanly into modern biological categories.
Why is there a woman there?
But regardless of classification, one thing remains
AI
consistent.
videos are getting
It was
too
large,
crazy.
it was vertical, and it stood alone above the landscape in a way that directly reflects a structural pattern, rather than a random biological form. Now move forward roughly 50 to 70 million years into the Carboniferous period around 350 million years ago, and the scale increases again.
You know, when people talk about Carboniferous period or the Ice Age and all these kinds of things, and so, I mean, how do you even come up with that? Like, how do you even come up with this explanation with carbon dating doesn't even provide that much detailed information about what happened at a certain age? Like, they're just making shit up, like what happened in the Ice Age. Like, how do they even know what happened in the Ice Age? How do they even know what happened in the Carboniferous age? It feels more like they actually like made up a lot about history. Like, that's just sounds like to me like.
As coal forests begin to spread across large regions of the planet. And within those forests existed organisms like Lepidodendron, which reached heights of 40 to 50 meters, comparable to a modern 15-story building. But what makes Lepidodendron different from modern trees is the way it grew, because for most of its life, it remained a single vertical column with minimal branching, expanding upward rather than outward, which means structurally it functioned less like a tree and more like a pillar, wide at the base, rising straight up, and terminating at the top in a defined structure rather than gradually tapering outward. At this point, you have two separate biological systems, separated by tens of millions of years, both producing dominant vertical forms that share the same core geometry, column-like growth, base support, and upward extension without complex lateral spread. And this is not speculation, but documented paleobotanical evidence that has been studied for decades, which establishes something critical for this investigation. The idea that life on Earth has already produced large-scale vertical structures that do not resemble modern trees, but instead resemble columns. Now the next step is not about growth, but about what happens after these organisms die. Because under normal conditions, organic material decomposes and disappears, but under specific environmental conditions, that process changes completely. And instead of decay, the structure is preserved through mineral replacement, specifically a process known as silicification, where silica-rich water permeates the cellular structure of the organism and gradually replaces the organic material at a microscopic level, leaving behind a complete structural replica composed of silicon dioxide, which is quartz. Quartz has a hardness of 7 on the Mohs scale, significantly harder than most surrounding sedimentary rock, which typically ranges between 2 and 4. And that difference in hardness is what determines what survives over geological time. Because as erosion removes softer material, the hardest structures remain standing, which means anything that undergoes silicification at scale becomes highly resistant to erosion compared to its surroundings. This is not theoretical because we have direct physical evidence of this process, most clearly visible in places like Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona, where entire tree trunks, some reaching lengths of over 60 meters, have been preserved in stone with internal cellular structures still visible, meaning the original biological form has been completely replaced by mineral while retaining its exact structure. And these are not small fragments, but massive preserved sections that demonstrate how large organic structures can transition into rock while maintaining their original geometry. Now here is where the scale question becomes unavoidable, because the fossil record does not preserve complete organisms in most cases. It preserves fragments, broken sections, partial remains, which means the largest examples we find are not necessarily the maximum size that existed, but simply the portions that survive the conditions required for preservation, and that creates a gap between what we can measure and what may have originally existed. Combine that with what we already know and the pattern becomes clearer. We have documented organisms reaching heights of 50 meters. We have a biological trend showing increasing scale over time. We have a known process that can convert organic structures into highly durable stone. And we have geological formations that remain standing specifically because they are harder than the material surrounding them. And each of these facts exists independently within its own field without controversy. But when you place them together, the question begins to form naturally. Because if a sufficiently large biological structure underwent mineralization and the surrounding material eroded over tens of millions of years, the result would not resemble a living organism. It would resemble a resistant structure embedded within the landscape. Something vertical, something durable, something isolated. Now, this does not prove anything on its own, and it is important to remain precise about that, because the difference in scale between known biological structures and large geological formations is significant, with mesas and buttes often reaching hundreds of meters in height and extending for kilometers in width, which creates a clear and valid objection that cannot be ignored. But that objection does not close the question, because we are working with incomplete records, limited samples, and a fossil archive that does not capture the full range of what once existed on this planet. And we already know that early life forms reached sizes that were once considered impossible before evidence forced those assumptions to change. So the question shifts again, not toward certainty, but toward possibility.
Yeah, we don't need to talk about the historicity of giants itself. Giants 100% existed. There's a lot of fossil evidence of giants existing.
Not asking whether mountains are trees, but whether the structural similarities we observe have been fully examined across disciplines. Because at this point, the comparison is no longer visual but structural, and structural patterns combined with known processes and incomplete data are not something that can be dismissed without investigation. And once you reach that point, the discussion moves beyond biology and geology as separate systems and into something else entirely. Because the real issue is not just what existed, but why the overlap between these two fields is rarely explored in a structured way. And that is where the next layer begins, not in the formations themselves, but in how those formations are interpreted, categorized, and ultimately explained. At this point, the question is no longer about whether erosion explains these formations, or whether ancient life reached significant scale, because both of those are already established. The real issue is how those ideas are separated once they are classified, because the moment something is defined as geological, it is studied within geological limits. And the moment something is defined as biological, it is studied within biological limits, which means anything that requires both perspectives at the same time is rarely examined as a single system. This separation is not unusual, it is how disciplines are structured, but it creates a limitation because it allows patterns that exist across fields to remain unexamined. And when that happens, the explanation becomes stable, without necessarily being complete. Now apply that directly to what we have already seen, because we are looking at large-scale formations that repeat the same geometry across different regions of the planet, and we are comparing that to biological systems that historically produced vertical, column-like structures. And we are placing that alongside a known process that can preserve organic form in stone, while making it more resistant to erosion over time. Each of these elements is accepted on its own, but they are not typically connected, and that is where the gap exists. Because once a structure is categorized as rock, the investigation focuses only on how rock behaves, how it erodes, and how it forms, but it does not usually ask whether the structure could have originated from something outside that category. Not because the idea has been disproven, but because it falls outside the framework used to analyze it. This becomes more important when you consider time, because over tens of millions of years, erosion removes context completely. It strips away surrounding material, it eliminates transitional forms, and it leaves behind only what is most resistant, which means what we see today is not a complete system, but a remainder, and remainders can be misleading. Because without the original context, structure is interpreted based on what remains, not what existed, and that introduces assumptions.
Bro, this dude's yapping about facts, bro. Like, he didn't even provide inconclusive evidence that Mountains are trees. Let's watch this video.
A lot of people don't realize
Yeah, it's a pretty good channel.
this.
Tales Old World, like, pretty good channel, like.
But the world used to be filled with extremely large trees that were much bigger than most of what we have today. And it's not that trees lost this ability. If the forests we have today were allowed to grow undisturbed for thousands of years or so, we would see these giant trees return. A lot of types of trees, given the right circumstances, will grow to huge proportions, but the conditions have to be perfect. Take the redwood, for example. Their range used to extend down into Mexico and as far north as British Columbia and Alaska. But if you plant it anywhere but its specific native conditions, it will grow, but it won't reach nearly as big as they do in California. These redwood and giant sequoia might be the very last
Damn, trees used to be this big, bruh.
giant trees, other than a few other pockets of slightly smaller trees dotted across the world. But what happened to all the rest? Why are there almost no more giant forests, when there used to be so many? Europeans first arrived in North America when it was filled with these giant trees, and there's a lot of other areas that used to have giants of their own. Europe, the British Isles, Lebanon, North Africa, and many other places still house some remaining giants outside of the California redwoods. Tasmania has eucalyptus trees over 300 feet tall, as do some parts of mainland Australia. There's a 275-foot tall spruce in the Himalayan region of India. Brazil has a native tree called Angelime vermilo, the tallest of which is 290 feet. Borneo, Malaysia, has the tallest tropical tree, reaching up to 330 feet. The tallest Norway spruce is in Slovenia, reaching 220 feet. The Sitka spruce is the tallest in Canada, reaching 322 feet. And there's also the giant cypress in Taiwan, reaching 266 feet. By comparison, though, the tallest redwood is 380 feet tall, estimated between 700 and 800 years old. But scientists say given enough time, these trees could, in theory, reach up to 425 feet, given current conditions on Earth. And other species have this potential to
Damn,
grow
bruh.
that big as well. such as certain cypress species, as well as spruce, Douglas fir, mountain ash, eucalyptus, and others could get pretty close. But conditions need to be perfect, and these trees I mentioned that still exist are only small remnants of what used to be. All these areas and more were covered with giants. And to figure out why they were destroyed, we need to look to the oldest known story in human history. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was found underground in ancient libraries of clay tablets written in cuneiform, we're told Gilgamesh defeated the guardian of the great cedar forest, believed to have been in Lebanon, Humbaba, sent to the forest to guard its massive trees by the god Enlil.
That's the most funny made-up name ever.
A forest that is almost completely gone today, with the tallest trees only reaching about 150 feet. However, in ancient times, the climate in the region was much more favorable, making the forest massive and the trees colossal. They're described in the Epic of Gilgamesh as tall enough to house a giant, with deep shade and awe-inspiring grandeur. And Gilgamesh and Enkidu went through the forest and picked out the largest and most significant trees to cut down, likely using them for building material in their kingdom of Uruk. But why?
The story of Gilgamesh is 100% historical. It's not even mythology like the mainstream tried to tell us. Not tell us it's a mythology, but we know that's... If you're in the conspiracy space, you know that's actually like pretty historical fact about Gilgamesh actually existed.
The story doesn't give a reason, but it's implied this act is a sort of show of power to the gods.
We know from the Sumerian kings list and the tablets and shit, like we know from that Gilgamesh actually existed.
A challenge saying that man can overcome the gods, or at least a man such as Gilgamesh may rise up and be equal with the gods. A challenge similar to the later story of Nimrod in the Tower of Babel. This was a common theme across many mythologies. These forests were seen as bridges in many cases, between the realm of the gods and the realm of man. That's why the god Enlil wanted so badly to guard it he sent the most feared giant. These forests in many cases were places the gods could interact with man. Many of the gods across multiple cultures were said to live in forests, as did many other creatures, some of them not so benevolent. In many cultures, demons lived in the forests. Japan, for example, the Tengu live in the forests and prey upon man. But when you think about it, this makes a lot of sense. On the surface, forests are dark and mysterious, and anything can be lurking around the corner, especially with giant-sized tree trunks everywhere. Bandits, predators, animals, and even possible cryptids could have existed in these ancient forests. But also, these were places you would find sacred psychoactive herbs and mushrooms. They still do this in the Amazon, the ayahuasca vine, and the accompanying DMT.
So crazy that psychedelics are like something that gives us or breaks the or decalcifies the pineal gland, something that gives us access to the astral dimension, something that gives us, breaks our 3 dimension into the 4th dimension and give access to all this other dimension. Like we can actually find these things in like the Amazon, or it's actually a plant that gives us access. It's actually like a substance from a plant that actually gives an access to the 4th dimension. It's actually crazy if you actually think about it.
Containing plants are cultivated deep in the Amazon jungle. The vine growing up and down these giant trees, and the plant growing in its shade. Not only that, but anybody who hunts mushrooms knows the best place to do.
If these kinds of mushrooms are already available to the public, then God knows whatever, there's a lot of psychedelics are not even like introduced to the public. A lot of, God knows whatever shit they're actually hiding, like mainstream scientists are actually hiding from the public. There's some. You think DMT is the best psychedelic? They have much more potent shit like that than that within their, within their archives.
So is in the forest. Mushrooms thrive on shade, moisture, and dying plant material falling from the canopy. Not only that, but the rarest, most potent, and most unique forms of mushrooms grow only in old-growth forests. And these rare old-growth mushrooms have the potential to cure things like cancer and other diseases, as well as contain psychoactive compounds. In one case, in Northern Europe, shamans consumed mushrooms, known as Amanita muscaria, the one that looks like the Super Mario mushroom or Santa Claus. And they've done so for thousands of years. And the old stories tell of crazy, mind-bending spiritual journeys that the shamans would embark on using these mushrooms. However, people today report that the experience from these mushrooms is actually very mild, and no more psychoactive than a few drinks of alcohol. And many have theorized as to why this is. One idea is that the old shamans knew how to pick these mushrooms in the exact spot, in the exact conditions, and the season to maximize their potency. This may be true, but I think it goes further. You see, unlike most mushrooms, Amanita muscaria live in perfect symbiosis with its host. It does not need to feed off rotting trees like some mushrooms, but it lives with the trees, assisting its growth and defense systems through mycorrhizal fungi. These are the communication systems plants use with each other. They can even transport nutrients to each other in the forest through these mushroom root systems, called mycorrhizal fungi. So I think it's possible when these forests were much older and much larger and much healthier, these Amanita muscaria mushrooms grew alongside these giant trees and were much, much more potent, possibly even growing to much larger sizes themselves. So is this picture as to why these trees have been destroyed becoming clear? Gilgamesh wanted not only to show the gods his power, but he wanted to say,
yeah, there's why giant trees are being cut, because it gives like some kind of evidence to the ancient world and antiquity Maybe some kind of like they have some kind of a mystical substance to it, like a lot of like mushrooms do. Like the reason why the mainstream is habit of denying everything that happens in antiquity and like there anything mystical. Like giant trees could be like a evidence for like things were way big back in the past, so they're trying to wipe all that information out. That's why giant trees being cut.
Ever the bridge between the spirit world and ours. At least that's what these ancient stories tend to say. In many cultures, we have something called the cosmic tree or world tree. We find this in the Hindu and Jain mythology with the cosmic banyan tree.
Bro, this is in every mythology whatsoever.
Yggdrasil in Scandinavian. The Ceiba tree in Mayan mythology. The Newt tree in Egyptian. The cosmic mango tree in Philippine mythology. And there's others I missed as well. This tree was seen as so large it reached down into the depths of Earth, and its branches could be seen in the sky connecting the heavens to the Earth. But often it was also seen as having a physical representation,
Yeah, universe itself is like a giant tree. This is a cosmic tree.
being an actual real tree as well. Yggdrasil, for example, with its Germanic equivalent, Irminsul, was said to be the largest tree in Europe, and it was where Odin, or Wotan in the German, hung himself to visit the spiritual realm and gain insight. Later, Charlemagne was said to have destroyed the sacred tree during the Saxon Wars as a show of power of Christianity over paganism. In Hindu and Buddhist traditions, we find stories of the Jambu tree. It's said to be located south of the sacred Mount Meru, the central axis of Earth according to Buddhist cosmology. This area where the tree grows is considered very sacred, a place where its inhabitants have reached enlightenment. The tree is described as so large its shade can cover entire regions, and its fruits are as large as elephants, oftentimes falling into rivers and dyeing them purple, and making them flow with sweet juice. In fact, it's believed that before Buddha meditated under the fig tree where he reached enlightenment, he first meditated under the Jambu tree. In Mesopotamian traditions, we find the Hulapu tree. In one version, the goddess Inanna, or Ishtar, found the Hulapu tree growing on the banks of the Euphrates River, and was so impressed by its magnificence and size, she transplanted it to her sacred garden in Uruk.
And we also like know about the tree of life and death, which is called has some kind of like a cosmological importance in like the Judeo-Christian paradigm. That itself, the tree of life, is what caused, the fall. Not directly caused, so it's like a test by God to our free will, like. And I genuinely believe the tree of life existed in the Garden of Eden, like maybe in like possibly the center of the world itself. And there's a lot of debate about where that Garden of Eden actually is. Is this still existing? Is there a secret place the government won't let us access? Like, there's a lot of speculation about that too.
There the tree grew much larger, but over time it became infested by various creatures, a serpent at its base, a bird in its branches, and the demoness Lilith in its trunk. Inanna seeks the help of Gilgamesh, who comes to her aid and drives the creature away, allowing the tree to be used to craft sacred objects like her throne and bed. There's also a story in Javanese legend about the Upas tree, or tree of death. This was a giant tree said to grow in the tropical regions on a certain island. However, the trees were highly poisonous and would not only take out anyone who tried to collect its sap, but would also render the entire land they inhabit barren of all other species of plants. The Upas tree legend became very popular among early European explorers to the region. In Chinese mythology, we have the sacred Fusang tree, which was said to be a giant-sized tree that grew on the sacred island of the Eight Immortals, located somewhere to the east of China. This island was said to have huge mountains on it, with the golden temples of the immortals atop them. It's described as tall and radiant, with branches reaching to the heavens, and it's located where the sun rises, where man practices the original form of Taoism and has reached immortality and enlightenment. The Aztec have a similar sacred tree, the tree of the sun and moon, associated with their sun god and the sun's life-sustaining abilities. There isn't a whole lot of significance of this tree, but it is depicted in several Aztec codices with the branches that connect to the celestial realm above, highlighting its role as a mediator between two worlds.
Aztec mythology is like crazy. They have like very weird creatures like gods, like feathered serpent, all this shit, bro. Aztec mythology goes crazy.
To the north in the Yosemite region, the Miwok tradition tells of the Wawana tree. In this tradition, they give us a specific tree, a giant sequoia no less, located in Yosemite National Park. To the natives, it was not just a giant tree, but a symbol of the enduring connection between the Miwok people and the natural world. And they cared for this tree and the surrounding forest with great reverence, as did many other cultures in the region with other trees. It gained fame in the late 19th century and early 20th century as a tourist attraction. It had a tunnel carved through it to allow people to drive through it, which was a common practice at the time to draw visitors to natural wonders. The tree was sometimes referred to as the Wawana Tree Tunnel. In Miwok tradition, all the giant sequoias, like the Wawana tree, were seen as sacred and embodying spiritual power. These trees were considered living ancestors, embodying the strength and resilience of the natural world. They played a role in Miwok ceremonies and stories, symbolizing the connection between the people and their environment. Sadly, the Wawana tree was damaged by fire and fell in 1969. severing the ties between the spirit world and our world in the eyes of many natives. Further north in Inuit mythology, a creature known as Galskap, a giant figure, is said to have used a gigantic tree for a spear during his battles. While the stories of Galskap vary, some describe the tree he wielded as being of incredible size, stretching across entire landscapes and symbolizing his immense power. The tree Galskap used is described as being larger than most trees in the natural world. And then of course we have the many stories of the Tree of Life, some of which overlap with these trees mentioned. In the Greek myths, the Tree of Life is the golden apple tree located on the island of Hesperides, far beyond the known world, only accessible to gods and their descendants, guarded by Ladon, the terrible sea serpent. In the Bible, there's a similar story. The Garden of Eden has two trees that are not known to mankind currently, the Tree of Life and the Tree of Knowledge. In the story, after Adam and Eve disobey God's command not to eat from the Tree of Knowledge, they are banished from the garden, leaving an angel guardian to keep man from entering, and to keep us from the Tree of Life. Similar to how Humbaba guards the cedar forest in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the Chinese even say a sea monster guards the sacred island of the Fusong tree. Some have theorized that this sacred land at the end of the world was America. And the trees these stories were referring to were not only the redwoods and the sequoias, but also the giant cypress, giant oaks, giant chestnut, and elm that were growing here when Europeans arrived. Huge trees the size of which is unmatched by all but the last remaining redwoods, but they were ordered all to be removed despite ancient knowledge of these trees being extremely important to the health of the forest. Instead of sacred areas where gods inhabited and rare medicinal plants and mushrooms grew, they were seen as something to be conquered, much like Gilgamesh saw the Lebanon cedar forest. The giant trees are the ultimate expression of God's or the gods' power on Earth, and became a major symbol of paganism and animism.
Yeah, that's the reason why they had to go. Like, even if a giant reactor as this is today, that would have been wiped out by the mainstream, like whoever's in charge of this world.
Because these trees were very much alive and fueled the forest, sending nutrients through the fungi, connecting to the plants around it, growing things like ayahuasca vine and magic mushrooms around it. It really seemed like these trees were inhabited by some kind of god or spirit. If anything in the environment was alive, other than animals and man, it was these giant trees. Living for thousands of years and contributing to the health of the entire forest around them. Rituals would be done at these sacred giant trees, and special care was taken of them before the Europeans arrived. Luckily, the last remnants of these still exist in California, but if you've never gotten to go over there and see them, I'd recommend adding it to your bucket list. Pictures do them no justice. The trees are as tall as skyscrapers and make you feel the power of God and nature. The fact that something can live so long and grow so big is incredible. Several redwood forests in California are also petrified in stone, so there's huge expanses of forest with giant ancient trees turned to stone. Pretty amazing to see in person. You feel like you're in some kind of fairy tale world. Now imagine much of the world is covered in those. That's what Earth was like thousands of years ago. At least the forested regions. It changes our whole perspective on forest-dwelling cultures, and could change the way many plants and mushrooms grew. Even the wood from these old-growth trees is much denser and stronger than normal wood. So maybe the destruction of these forests was only because of the expansion of our modern world. Or maybe someone had an agenda to sever our connection to these sacred spaces, and take away our access to the medicinal qualities these trees provide, in turn making us weaker and less spiritually adept. I wonder if the Buddha still would have reached enlightenment if he had not had the sacred fig tree or jambu tree to meditate under. Or if Odin would not have seen the secrets of death and the universe if he had not been able to hang himself from the giant Yggdrasil tree. Or if the Temple of Solomon would not have been worthy of housing the Ark of the Covenant without the special wood brought by the Phoenician ships from an unknown land called Ophir in the Bible. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think.
Yeah. So that's also one thing. Like this Solomon's temple was something about Ophir. Like, you don't actually see that in the Old Testament. Also, like, it's crazy. So that's about it. Giant trees actually existed, and some of the giant trees are visibly present as mountains or plateaus today. And reason why that's not relevant information or a naturalistic explanation because they don't want you to know about giant trees. But that proves giants also. That also shows things were big back then. And that's a big no-no to the mainstream establishment.